Hello retro lovers and welcome back. My apologies for keeping you waiting these past few weeks. I've been a little run down organising gigs and planning some videos that take a lot longer to work on. Plus I recently came down with something and I had to take some time to recover. Now to fill the gap and keep things moving on the channel, I thought I would take a bit of time to share with you my top 20 favourite films. Now, I tried so hard to whittle this list down to just 10 films, but it turns out that I love films so damn much that it just wasn't possible. I only just managed to squeeze these films into a top 20 list, and even then I have a few honourable mentions. Now, because this list is a top 20, to conserve time, I'm going to try not to go into great detail with these films. I'm just going to give my basic thoughts on each of them, and then maybe I'll go into more depth in future videos. Now, before we get started, I just want to point out that I'm not claiming these films to be the best films of all time or the greatest films ever made. This is just my personal favourite top 20 films. Films that I enjoy watching for various reasons. If you have any agreements or disagreements, then please leave them in the comments below and I'd be happy to discuss your opinions with my own. So, let's get started with my 4 honourable mentions. Good Morning Vietnam. I always think if there was one other film that Robin Williams should have won an Oscar for, it's this one. His performance as the late Armed Forces radio DJ Adrian Cronauer has the perfect balance of hilariously funny to deadly serious, and Williams carries both off to absolute perfection. As with many of his performances, Williams improvised his way through the radio broadcast scenes, and as one would expect, he did so in a way that only he could. As well as Williams' sublime performance, we also have the awkwardly funny Bruno Kirby playing an egotistical lieutenant who tries to prove his worth as a comedian, a great chemistry between Williams and Forest Whitaker, and a very focused direction from Barry Levinson. It's also a joy to watch Williams mingling with the friends he makes. It's very heartwarming. This is one of those great films that knows how to make you laugh and cry in just the right amounts. The comedy scenes are great, but the dramatic scenes are incredibly realistic and constantly remind us that we're in the middle of Saigon during the war. It's a film that lets us know just how important laughter is, even during a deadly conflict. So whether it's for the superb performances, the laugh out loud moments, the awesome soundtrack, or the enjoyment of seeing Williams do what he did best, this film is definitely one to say good morning to. Blade Runner. I must admit I had difficulty keeping this one off of the main list. I just didn't know where to rank it, so I finally decided that maybe it just belongs on its own outside of an official list. Now, every time I watch this film, I try so hard to make sense of the story, as I do find it difficult to follow. It's almost like watching a dream, which is ironic seeing as it's based on a novel called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. But when it comes to Blade Runner, I tend to just forget about the story and focus mostly on just how beautiful it looks. The set designs, the lighting, the shadows, the camera work, it all creates a breathtakingly beautiful dystopian futuristic world. Combine that with a haunting soundtrack, solid performances from Harrison Ford, Daryl Hannah and Rutger Hauer, along with the direction from Ridley Scott, and you've got an atmospheric gem that has actually become one of the greatest science fiction films of all time. Mrs. Brown. Yeah, I know, not what you were expecting, right? Well, who isn't a fan of Billy Connolly? Well, here's another question. Who isn't a fan of Billy Connolly and Judi Dench? Mrs. Brown is a beautifully filmed story with absolutely flawless performances from both Dench and Connolly respectively. The two of them have such an amazing chemistry, both on and off screen, and watching the two of them here is just so heartfelt and genuine. It's almost like watching a documentary. Dench as Queen Victoria gives her usual passion and presence to the role, whilst Connolly, as her Scottish servant and controversial love interest, gives arguably one of the finest performances of his career. I always enjoy watching this film. It's the perfect film to stick on during a wet Sunday afternoon. It's not a comedy for sure, but watching this film always leaves me smiling. Well, until the end, that is. Edward Scissorhands. Whilst I'm not the biggest fan of Tim Burton's dark style of abstract environments, twisted sculptures and recycled choirs oohing and ahhing, there are a few exceptions of his I do admire, and this is one of them. Johnny Depp plays Edward, an artificial man created by an old inventor played by the legendary Vincent Price in his last film role. The old inventor dies before he can finish Edward, leaving him with large blades and scissors for hands. Edward is taken in by a kindly Avon lady and falls in love with her daughter, played by Winona Ryder. But he soon discovers that life in the real world isn't always as nice as it looks. I never really see the story of this film being about Edward. It's more about society and the way that we, people, often behave around those who are different. As Edward tries to adjust to being around people, it's interesting to see how those people adjust to him. The story also shows just how harmful the consequences of gossiping can be. Something perfectly honest and innocent can happen, and then someone tells one friend, and then they tell their friends, and they tell their friends, and so on, and so on, and so on. It's only a matter of time before people get the wrong idea and things start to spiral out of control. It's a kind of madness in a way, and the story here demonstrates that well, I think. It's a classic dark fantasy that takes the original Frankenstein story and turns it into a beautiful suburban fairy tale. Okay, so that's my honourable mentions out of the way. Let's now get to the official top 20 list, but before we do, I would just like to say, if, like me, you are a big retro fan and would like to stay updated with retro-related videos on the channel, then please consider clicking the subscribe button below and hit the bell button to be notified when I upload new videos to the channel. Okay, let's get started on my top 20 favourite films. Number 20. As Good as It Gets. Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt are on Oscar-winning form here. Nicholson plays Melvin, an obsessive-compulsive misanthropic writer who becomes interested in Carol, a stressed but patient coffee shop waitress played by Hunt. As a person on the autistic spectrum, I can relate to Nicholson's character somewhat. He always tries to remain in control of his life in a world where people don't understand him or even want to. Now, when his gay neighbour Simon gets brutally attacked in a robbery, Melvin is forced to take care of his dog, which is where things start to get interesting for Melvin, for Carol and for Simon. Through a series of events, the three of them end up taking a road trip together, during which they start to discover new things about themselves. Melvin slowly begins to soften up and becomes more open and relaxed to the changes in his life, particularly regarding his feelings for Carol, who of course he falls in love with. The chemistry between Nicholson and Hunt is so good here. The way Hunt works off of Nicholson's character is so natural. When he inadvertently insults her son, who is seriously ill, the reaction on her face shows the anger, but at the same time you can still see the tolerance that she has for this man. The acting in this film is just great. Along with Nicholson and Hunt, there's also Greg Kinnear, Cuba Gooding Jr., and even a small cameo from the late Harold Ramis, who is always a joy to watch. Number 19. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. True, there have been many adaptations of Stoker's great novel, and I'm not saying this is the best one out of all of them. I'm just saying that this one is my personal favourite. It isn't flawless by any means, but the way the film was made is a work of art. It captures the preternatural atmosphere so well by using clever editing and camera tricks to really make us feel that there is some non-human presence at work here. Take this shot for instance.
My humblest apologies.
The trickery used to show Dracula catching the object is so simple, yet so effective. We immediately get that this is a creature not of this world. The film is jam-packed with other incredible theatrical effects like that. It's beautiful to watch. At times it's almost like watching a stage adaptation, particularly with the set design as well. Everything looks like it's being performed on a stage, and that's no complaint from a theatre graduate like myself. I just love the way this film was made. The performances in this version are hit and miss. Gary Oldman is fine when he's being young Dracula, but he's let down by a couple of over-the-top transformations like the Bat, for example. The supporting cast are good enough. Richard E. Grant does a good job as the lovelorn Dr. Seward. Cary Elwes is the perfect choice to play the quaint Englishman Arthur Holmwood, and Sadie Frost is convincing as the sexually charged Lucy Westenra. The letdowns here, in my opinion, are Winona Ryder as Mina and Keanu Reeves as Jonathan. Ryder is generally okay, but doesn't seem to have much chemistry with Oldman. Mina is supposed to be Dracula's long-lost love, but here the connection between them just doesn't come across very convincingly. Keanu Reeves is just a complete miscast. His performance is bland and his accent, oh my god, his accent. I have nothing against Reeves personally, I actually quite like him in most of his films, but who had the idea of casting him as Jonathan Harker? I think the best performance comes, not too surprisingly, from Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing. This is a character who is supposed to show a great passion for finding Dracula. He does want to stop Dracula, but at the same time he shows a great interest and admiration for him, and Hopkins does a good job portraying the character. The director, Francis Ford Coppola, always seems to know how to capture the atmosphere of whatever story is being told, and this film is certainly no exception. It's by no means a perfect adaptation, but as a theatrical experience, this one is certainly at the top of the list. I would have loved to have seen this one on the big screen. Number 18. Rain Man. I may not be an autistic savant, but believe me, there is a lot to this character I can relate to. Tom Cruise plays Charlie, a somewhat cold and ruthless car salesman who, upon learning that his estranged father has died, discovers that he has an older brother, an autistic savant named Raymond, played brilliantly by Oscar-winning Dustin Hoffman. This is basically one of those road trip films. When Charlie realises that his father has left millions to Ray, he effectively kidnaps him for ransom, and the two of them head off across the country, and it's obviously on this road trip that the two of them start to bond and learn things about each other, etc. It's obviously Hoffman's incredible performance here that steals the show. Looking at him, you would swear this is a man with autism. It's an absolutely flawless performance. That's not to disregard Cruise's performance, though. As he and Hoffman have a great chemistry and work off each other really well, you really do believe that these two are brothers. One thing I particularly like about this film is the passage of time. It's filmed in a way that really shows the right amount of time passing. It doesn't rush, nor does it drag. It moves along at just the right pace and shows a beautiful natural relationship develop between the two characters. There are, of course, many great scenes in this film. The toothpick scene, the casino scene, the dancing scene, and that wonderful CHARLIE scene. They're all just superb. This is definitely a great film. Definitely. Definitely a great film. Definitely a great film. Definitely a great film. Number 17. Misery. Say what you like about horror films, this one has got to be up there with the most terrifying. I think what makes the premise of this story so frightening is that technically it could happen. Kathy Bates, another Oscar winner, plays Annie Wilkes. Oh, God, even the sound of that name sends a chill down my spine. A nurse who is obsessed with romance novelist Paul Sheldon, played by James Caan. When Sheldon gets into a car crash, he is found by Wilkes, who takes him back to her remote lodge out in the Colorado hills. Annie, at first, comes across as very friendly. She tends to Paul's wounds and begins to nurse him back to health, but Annie gradually starts to show signs of obsession and madness towards Paul, particularly when she discovers that he kills off the main character of his book. Bates' performance here is terrifyingly realistic. The way that she explosively dips in and out of her emotions shows what a versatile actress she is. One minute she'll be sort of calm and collected, but then the next minute she'll be all over the place, screaming and yelling. Caan also does a great job playing the victim to Annie's insanity. Whilst you can't always tell what Annie is thinking and plotting, at the same time you can't always tell what he's thinking and plotting either. It does actually get quite intense at times. There's also a great sense of claustrophobia. Most of the film takes place within Annie's house, and this really adds to the feeling of helplessness and isolation. The only time we go outside of the house is when Buster, a local town sheriff, starts an investigation into Paul's whereabouts. Things start to get really, really suspenseful as Buster gets closer and closer to finding Paul. I won't spoil what happens, but I hope the edge of your seat is nice and comfortable. Whenever I watch this film, I always ask myself, what would I do in the same situation? Would I play along with Annie's madness, or would I do whatever I could to get out of there, regardless of what she would do to me? What would you do? Number 16. The Graduate. What amazes me about this film is, whilst it was made in 1967, the humour is actually quite modern and fits in with comedy you might see today. A very young Dustin Hoffman plays Benjamin, a recent college graduate who has lost direction in his life and doesn't know what he wants to do with his future. Ben's overbearing parents throw him a graduation party, at which he encounters Mrs. Robinson, a longtime family friend. Noticing Benjamin's vulnerability, Mrs. Robinson lures him back to her house where she attempts to seduce him. It's Hoffman's awkwardness that provides most of the comedy for me. The scene where Ben is meeting Mrs. Robinson at a hotel is just hilarious. He just doesn't know what to do with himself. He's so nervous, and I just love the little squeaks he keeps letting out. The ending, of course, is very famous and has been parodied many times by several other films and TV shows, but I personally think it's the weakest part of the film. The editing is weird and it just feels rushed, like they were trying to squeeze it all in at the very end. It doesn't ruin the film, but I feel they could have done more with it. I won't go as far as saying it's one of the funniest films I've ever seen, but the humour is certainly clever and, as mentioned, very modern for the time. Solid performances from actors with good comedy timing is also a bonus. Hoffman does an amazing job being a hilarious nervous wreck. Anne Bancroft stuns as the alluring Mrs. Robinson. Catherine Ross does a beautiful job in every sense of the word as Mrs. Robinson's daughter Elaine, whom Ben eventually falls for. And William Daniels plays the small but memorable role as Ben's overbearing father. If you fancy a classic bit of 60s comedy with a modern twist and an exceptional song track to hum along to, then this film is sure to seduce you. Number 15. The Princess Bride. I was actually introduced to this film as part of a school project. We were learning about the mastery of sword fighting and my teacher showed us the incredible sword fighting sequence. I immediately became intrigued and had to see the whole film. It's a fairy tale story told through the perfect scenario of a kindly grandfather reading it to his grandson who is ill in bed. I'm not sure if this film qualifies as a spoof or not. It is a comedy and it doesn't take itself too seriously, but I think it gets away with it on account of the fact that it's a fairy tale, and since when do fairy tales take themselves seriously? I'm going to skip going into the story here as there is just so much to cover and each individual character has their own little adventure going on, so I'll quickly talk about the cast and characters. The young and ruggedly handsome Cary Elwes plays Wesley, a farm boy turned pirate on a quest to save his lost love. Robin Wright plays Buttercup, Wesley's long-lost love who is forced to marry Prince Humperdinck. Chris Sarandon plays Prince Humperdinck, who is disgustingly brilliant and egotistical, a brilliant performance. One of my favourite comedy actors, Christopher Guest, plays Count Tyrone Rugen. It's a good performance, but it's a shame that Guest doesn't get to do that much in this film, and he doesn't get much comedy either. There are several cameo appearances scattered about the film, including Billy Crystal, Peter Cook, and even Mel Smith, to name a few. But without a doubt, the ones that steal the show are Wallace Shawn, Mandy Patinkin, and Andre the Giant as Fassini, Inigo Montoya, and Fezzik, respectively. Not forgetting, of course, the very warming performance by Peter Falk as the grandfather. The way that this film is put together is quite unique. It does feel like a fairy tale, but at the same time it feels like it may be slightly self-aware and making a bit of fun out of the genre, like when Wesley and Buttercup kiss and the film will cut back to the boy's bedroom where the boy says he doesn't like kissing. I think that's one of the several reasons why this film is a favourite. Maybe we need to poke a little harmless fun at this kind of genre occasionally. I know I certainly do. Do you agree, or do you find that notion inconceivable?
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Number 14. The Birdcage. For some reason I put off seeing this film for such a long time. People kept telling me how good it was, but I just wasn't interested at first. Then it was shown on television one night and I decided to give it a go. Robin Williams and Nathan Lane, in one of his best roles in my opinion, play gay partners who run a drag club on Miami Beach. Williams has a grown-up son who is getting married, but his fiancée hasn't told her conservative parents that her future in-laws are gay. Thusly, when they plan to visit Miami, the son asks his fathers to pretend to be straight. This is basically your classic sitcom scenario, resulting in a dinner party where things start to go wrong and hilarity ensues. It's very farcical, and with it being based on an original French farce, that's to be expected. The actors all round are very well cast and give great performances. Williams, as always, blends comedy and drama together well and uses his improv skills to perfection, particularly during the dinner scene. I just love the scene where everyone keeps falling over, and even Williams can't help but let out a little chuckle. Nathan Lane is perfect as the effeminate other half of the comedy duo. The scenes where Williams teaches Lane how to do things like a straight man always has me in stitches. Hank Azaria plays Agador Spartacus, an exuberant Guatemalan housekeeper. He's funny throughout the film, but funniest during the dinner scene. Don't be drinking anything during that scene, you will choke. Gene Hackman also stars as the conservative future in-law. His character is basically the stooge stuck in the middle of the comedy madness. I won't spoil the ending if you haven't seen it, but let's just say towards the end, he gets into the swing of things. So if you feel like a bit of old-fashioned farcical comedy in a modern setting, this film hits all the right notes. Number 13. Transformers 2007, plus the first 3.5 minutes of Bumblebee. I saw the first trailer for the Transformers film and I didn't think much of it. I just found it hard to believe that the Transformers universe, which consisted mainly of intergalactic space battles, etc., could be translated onto the big screen. However, I gave it a chance and was immediately blown away. I grew up in the 80s and 90s when the Transformers were all over the place and I was crazy about them. So when I watched the Autobots transform on the big screen, my jaw just dropped open. I remember thinking, wow, they've done a great job with the voice of Optimus Prime. It sounds just like Peter Cullen. And then I saw the credits and realised it was Peter Cullen. The original voice of Optimus Prime was back. Watching the Transformers on the screen, however, are really the only real pleasure I get out of this film. I'm not the biggest fan of Michael Bay films, but when it comes to making over-the-top action with a comic book style, I'd say he was perfectly suited for this one. I'm also not the biggest fan of Shia LaBeouf or Megan Fox, but I suppose they both do well enough with what they're given here. You just have to be willing to put up with a lot of overacting and forced comedy that isn't really that funny. It's a shame that the sequels were just rehashed versions of the original. What I wanted to see for a sequel was a big screen version of the Transformers battling it out with the Decepticons across the stars, with no overacting humans getting in the way. Speaking of which, I found the Bumblebee film to be slow and not very engaging. There wasn't much to it except for Bumblebee hiding out from the bad guys in the suburbs, kind of like a robotic rehash of E.T. But the opening to that film, oh my God. The first 3.5 minutes of this film is exactly what I want to see in a live-action Transformers film. The Autobots and Decepticons fighting the war of Cybertron actually on Cybertron. Just look at this. It's the sights, the sounds, the voices from my childhood on the big screen, and it's so beautiful I could cry. But then they go and send Bumblebee to Earth, and that's the end of that. If they're going to make a big budget Transformers film, why don't they just extend those 3.5 minutes into a full 90? Set it on Cybertron in the middle of the war and have the Autobots and Decepticons fighting an all-out war. That's all us kids from the 80s want to see. Please. Pretty please. Number 12. The Blair Witch Project. Forget the blood and guts and people being slashed or mutilated to death. I think the key to a great horror film isn't what you see, it's what you don't see. And this film is a fine example. It may not have been the first found footage film to ever grace the screen, but it certainly popularized the genre. Three film students head out into the woods of Maryland to investigate the legend of the Blair Witch. The project seems to be going well at first, but as each night passes, things seem to get creepier and creepier, and the three of them come to realise that maybe they're not alone out there in the woods after all. I once saw this film at one of those outdoor cinema events. It was shown at night in the middle of the woods with everyone sat around a huge screen in their camping gear. It was one of the most awesome cinema experiences of my life. The film is amazing. It's shot entirely on home video cameras and does everything it can to keep up the pretense that it just might be real. The three cast members, while technically acting, were only given small secretive directions as to what they were supposed to be doing out there in the woods. At no point did they know what was going to happen or when, so when something does happen, their reactions are pretty much real. As mentioned, there's no blood or guts or visible killing shown on screen. The film does an amazing job building up creepy images in your head. You can only imagine what's going on out there in the darkness, and I think that's what really adds to the horror of it all. Sometimes you don't need to see the gory details. Your imagination can paint a bigger picture than you can ever see on screen. The ending of this film is also left ambiguous. You never actually see what happens to these kids at the end. The cameras just go blank, and then that's the end of the film. You don't know if they live or whether they die or whether something else entirely happens to them. You're just left wondering what the hell happened to them out there in the woods. It's incredible. Unfortunately, two sequels were made to this masterpiece. The first sequel was total garbage, whilst the second sequel may not have been great, but you can at least see a lot more effort went into it. Neither of the sequels could even come close to what the original achieved, though. Number 11. Life of Brian. From the sublime to the ridiculous, Life of Brian has got to be one of the funniest films ever made. It's literally a laugh a minute, and every laugh is as good as the last one. The Monty Python boys put everything they had into this comedy masterpiece, and it absolutely shows. The authenticity of this film is right up there with Ben-Hur. You would swear this all takes place at the time of Christ. There isn't a single soundstage used. The story basically runs parallel to that of Jesus Christ. Three wise men follow a star to Bethlehem to pay homage to the newborn Son of God. However, they end up in the wrong stable, and instead they pay homage to Brian, a baby who just happens to have been born on the same night. And why not? From this point on, the film is basically about Brian constantly getting mistaken for Jesus and winding up in all sorts of trouble with the bloody Romans. This is another film that is very cleverly put together. Each Python plays several different characters, and it's all played out very convincingly. As mentioned, the comedy works perfectly. However, there are one or two moments I always feel go a bit too far. There's this moment where Brian is being chased and he suddenly gets picked up by a spaceship. Now, I appreciate that the Python boys usually did go that one step further, but personally, this doesn't work for me. I could happily go into the entirety of the story here, but so much goes on at such a pace that we'd be here for hours. Just take my word for it, it's a piece of comedy gold, ending with that classic feel-good song at the end.